So welcome to session 37 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. It's all old hands here, so I don't have to go through any of the stuff that we normally do. And today we're talking about Gordon Dickson's Dorsai or Childe series of novels. So what we always do is a bit of biographical stuff. Do you want to jump into that right away, or should we jump into the world building? What do you think?
Let's do biography.
Okay.
Since I've read some of his other books.
Oh yeah. So in a way he's a interesting transplant because he starts out in Canada, but he becomes Americanized so quickly. His father dies when he's quite young, and his mother moves him to Minneapolis, and that's more or less where he stays most of his life, apart from his stint in the U.S. Army during World War II. So that by itself would be, I suppose, enough to sort of make him fully U.S. American, and Canadians could contest, whether they're American as well. And he goes to the University of Minnesota. Apparently, he was there when Sinclair Lewis was also in the writing program. So they must have exchanged some interesting things. Nobody's really fully formed in a program, though, right? And you notice there's not an awful lot of biographical things to say about him. He went to science fiction cons a lot. He got a lot of awards. He fairly early in his career became a professional writer. So I think that's kind of a contrast to many of the people who we've been looking at so far, where their career just wouldn't take off for them. Like think about Philip Jose Farmer, where he couldn't get anything paid for a long time, and only could become a professional writer later on. So by 1950, he has his first story co-written with Paul Anderson published in Fantastic Story Quarterly, and then he follows it up the next year in Astounding with The Friendly Man. And I only listed his novels, but you can see that there's a number of them. And I highlighted the ones that are part of the Dorsai series, and you can see they're really quite spread out. And many of them, we've talked about this in the past about the fix-up phenomenon, where you take a short story and then you kind of build it out. A. Van Vogt was really well known for that. So it looks like Dickson did that with quite a few of these as well. But then eventually the Dorsai or Childe series, it took on a very, very vast structure that was never completely seen through, largely because of Dickson dying. So he had plans for developing it much further, but it never was able to be realized. So we'll talk about some of that scope in a bit. You notice that he's I didn't put in all the awards that he gets, but he gets quite a few of them. We were talking before about the Dragon series as well. He's churning those out. The Dragon and the George is early on, but then in the 90s he's churning them out fairly regularly in the thing. And he's got all sorts of other series. He did quite a few collaborative works with other authors, not just Paul Anderson, but some others as well. So there isn't that much to say about his biography. It's not like he appears to have had a lot of ups and downs the way many of our other authors did. And he one of the things I did find out that was kind of interesting is there's a con, and I think it's called Minicon, a science fiction. Yeah, have you ever gone to that?
I've been to it.
Yeah, he I guess he was instrumental in getting it underway because he was there, And they have his papers up at the University of Minnesota. Boxes and boxes and boxes of them. I think it would be kind of interesting to find out about him. It's not that far. And as a matter of fact, I should mention, so next month we're doing somebody who's even closer, August Derleth, from Wisconsin. But, Dickson apparently spent a good bit of time in Wisconsin, and I haven't checked it out yet, but he wrote some poems and some pieces that are, mostly about Wisconsin and Minnesota and the landscape. So those might be interesting to see. So let's jump right into this vast world series. The handout that I created for this is basic. It's very rudimentary, and it's just showing the different planets that are in this. What would we call it? The expansion of humanity into the stars. And like a lot of other authors, he doesn't have us jumping immediately to the edge of the galaxy or anything like that. It's all the closest star systems that we could get into. And the reason why all of these matter is because in the universe that he creates, the narrative universe, humankind has changed by going out to the stars. And, we see this in other authors like who we've talked about recently, like C.J. Chera, where it takes us a while to get to places. We establish colonies. Those colonies to establish their own sort of basis. I think you could say Ursula K. Le Guin is like that too, with her Heinisch novels. And then the question is, well, what becomes of us? What becomes of humanity? And I found it really useful to have this book, this 3 to Dorsai edition, because it's got some of the Dorsai novels arranged in the chronological sequence rather than the sequence that he wrote them. Yeah. So the first one is this Necromancer book, and that takes place on Earth, and it takes place in the 21st century. The extent in time of the whole series is, well, in a way, the extensive part of the whole series is out to the 24th century, and mankind is actually expanding pretty quickly through the cosmos. They discover faster than light drives, of course, which is a necessity if you're going to have interstellar travel that means anything, and you're not just using colony ships. But this was nice because it had Necromancer in it, and then Tactics of Mistake, which is I think the second one that he wrote.
Third or maybe the fourth on this list.
Yeah, you're right. So. Well, I didn't highlight Dorsai. It's the fourth. So Dorsai is first, which was originally the Genetic General, then Necromancer, then Soldier Ask Not, then Tactics of Mistake. So those are all in the same time period. Later on, he's getting into these others, but it's nice because they're arranged in a sequence, and there's some speculative stuff in between them, sandwiched in there about what the storyline was supposed to be about. And so Necromancer is a good one to start with. The world building is happening, I guess you could say, through elaborating what humanity is turning into on these different worlds. So, as a matter of fact, this would be a good place to jump into one of the big philosophical themes, because I think it'll make sense out of the world building. So he talks in terms of splintering, and he uses the term racial instinct quite a bit in this, but he doesn't mean race in terms of the races that we typically think of. He means the human race breaking itself into different groups. And so I guess the place to start with that is at the end of Necromancer. So humanity is kind of in a bind. They're going out to the stars, going to different places, and establishing new ways of living. Each colony is drawing in people attracted to a certain type. So Earth remains what he calls broad spectrum. Humans like you and I, where we have a whole bunch of different traits all kind of rolled in. We're kind of, messy contradictions, because we might have one, more predominating than the other. If in our life we have one thing totally dominating us, we become monomaniacs, and we wind up going insane, or getting in charge of something and creating terrible catastrophes that way. But in these colonies, when they go out, they draw in these personality types, or you could call them also spiritual aspects of humanity, and each one is able to develop along its own line. So, if you look at the different worlds, the Dorsai are the military world. They become the finest mercenaries. It's largely a water world, and they're trained from the infancy basically to be super soldiers. They follow a very strict code of conduct. They have a decentralized government that's split over a number of different power centers, and they're associated with this very martial culture. So it represents in a way it's almost Platonic, right? This courageous, theomatic aspect of human beings. Plato in the Republic talks about some of us are naturally more spirit-driven than others, and those are the ones you want for your soldiers and warriors. And the Dorsai become this military force of mercenaries who are, more or less unstoppable compared to other soldiers. And it's actually speculated that if they decided to, they could actually take over all the worlds. New Earth, it also remains like old Earth, full spectrum, so it's people like us. Mercury and Mars, they don't really play much of a role in the stories because they are colonized, but they're not effectively colonized to where they can become independent worlds. And then you get all these other things like Freyland, which is colonized mostly by Northern Europeans, and it's associated with like hard work ethic, lots of bureaucracy. It attracts that sort of officious type. Dunnan's world is largely fishermen. There's not that much to say about that. Kobe is a mining world that doesn't have, it was never terraformed. They build underground. It's also kind of a place where the mob can run things, criminal organizations. Workers don't always have it too great. Sant Marie, which is in the same area as the exotics, gets settled, and I don't remember the explanation, but it gets settled by a bunch of Catholics, and they set themselves up as farmers, so they're providing agricultural products to people. Keti is a commercial world, trading and engaging in some manufacturing as well. And then you got these three other associations that are particularly important. I mean, you could say like Keti, okay, the commercial aspect, and the little Adam Smith in each of us, right? That could be the archetype for that. But you've got these other three that are really important in the story, and I'll come to the two that are more important later. First, let's talk about the hard sciences worlds. So Venus gets settled, and in the process of settlement, you get all these people who are primarily interested in either the sciences or the applications of the sciences going out there and living a life together. So it's sort of like a colony. Well, I mean, it is a colony. I'm saying it's sort of like when we here on this world, we have colonies of people who have those sorts of, like imagine we took NASA and all the science departments of our universities, and what else would we stick in there?
Silicon Valley?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, Silicon Valley. And we just sort of threw them all together into one big group and said, Okay, go to it. So Venus and Newton, those are the ones that are really specializing in the sciences as such. And, apparently like Newton, the best physicists come from there because that's where the best schools are. And so it kind of makes sense. And then Casita is where the technicians come from, the technicians and the engineers. So there's kind of a split in between there. The theoretical and the applied, right? Or the theoretical and the practical. And it produces people who see the world through the lens of the hard sciences rather than, the social sciences or the humanities or anything like that. The friendlies, and almost everybody who comments on it says, totally incorrectly named given what happens in the stories. The friendlies are settled by these people who are primarily interested in practicing their religion. And they could be very, very nice, sort of faith-oriented people with strong spiritual life, or they can be complete fanatic jerks and everything in between. And on the two worlds of the friendlies, there's all these different churches that fight with each other, but they're also within an association as well. And each of the worlds produces something. So, from Casita, you get all sorts of technical products coming out, right? Or from Sainte Marie, you've got all these agricultural products. The friendlies, they're kind of a poor set of worlds. The farming that they do is just subsistence farming for themselves. They don't produce much. Their main export is soldiers. So they're kind of like in the same boat as the Dorsai, except the Dorsai export high-quality soldiers who are trained to, think about the best tactics and minimize casualties and maximize their effectiveness. The friendlies sell cannon fodder because, their people are filled with faith, and they can tell them, they tell them things like, there's victory and there's death, and death really doesn't matter, so just go out there and fight. And so they sell their soldiers all over the place. The exotics get their start at the end of the Necromancer book, and they're what the original Chantry Guild in that book are. A bunch of people who are interested in philosophy, but not, just like history of philosophy. And as a matter of fact, we were talking about that PPE program, philosophy, politics, economics. Imagine taking that, because with so philosophy and let's say instead of economics, it was philosophy, politics, and psychology, right? Mm-hmm. And then add some more esoteric stuff into it that has to do with manipulating unseen forces. So there's kind of an occult part to it, but it can be understood in terms of psychology. And then you've got the exotics. The exotics are these people who are specialized in that aspect. I guess the other humanities would kind of fit in there too, the fine arts and stuff like that, an appreciation for that. And they and the friendlies really don't get along, because the friendlies view them as just a bunch of heretics and godless people that are they're trying to occupy the same spiritual space in a way, And so you've got already some rivalries between these. And the way that Dickson sets up his sort of grand story, you've got all sorts of individual characters who are coming out of these worlds and representing their types. But it's also sort of like, humanity goes out, fans out into all these different groups, and the archetypes, or whatever you want to call them, aspects of humanity are also struggling with each other through the medium of worlds and warfare and economics and all of that sort of stuff. So it's a pretty vast conception that's going on, and it happens through a narrative where colonization goes out and occurs that way. And originally, so we'll come back to the theme of what's happening in Necromancer. In the next main book, The Tactics of Mistake, and some of the associated things, Earth still is playing a major role, and the other colony worlds haven't become completely independent of Earth's interference yet. And Earth is playing a major role, in part because Earth is still divided between two main power alliances. One is called the Alliance and one is called the Coalition. And it's supposed to be like, West and East. So you've got like presumably America and Europe and maybe South America and maybe Japan or something like that in the Alliance. And then you've got the Coalition. And then they play proxy wars on these planets. And then you've got also the Dorsai slowly establishing themselves as some of the best commanders and soldiers, but they haven't completely broken away. And the sort of story arc of that through the character Donald Graham is to find a way for the Dorsai to actually become independent and begin offering a third option for all these governments to hire instead of having to be part of Earth's orbit, you could say, through either belonging to either being a coalition ally or being an alliance ally. And so that ends up, reducing the role of Earth in many respects in the later books, but it also ends up allowing all these other groups to spiral off and become their own thing. So there's this to go back to it, this splintering. If you think about it in terms of philosophical themes, like in our society, well, really going back throughout politics and philosophy, one of the key ideas has been division of labor, right? Specialization. You can think of it in terms of like Plato and 3 parts of the city and 3 parts of the soul. It's usually got to be more complicated than that, but in Aristotle and the Politics, you get a much more complicated arrangement, but there is specialization, and specialization tends to produce different, or maybe not produce, but reward certain human types, certain modes of behavior. So academics are a different kind of people than farmers, are a different kind of people than mechanics, are a different kind of people than city administrators, and so on. So when humanity is going out into the void and landing on these planets, what Dickson portrays this as being is not just sort of some contingent historical development of they just happen to find that mechanics worked well for them, or this is a mining planet, so therefore it's not geographic determinism, right? Instead, it's different parts of humanity needed to go off and find their own place to develop in their own way, so that they could develop further than they would be able to in an interdependent matrix on Earth. So like the friendlies with their exploration of faith, or the Dorsai with their exploration of what it means to be militaristic and courageous, or the exotics with their philosophical development. And so he frames this in terms of through the mouths of his characters, particularly through those of the exotics, who are kind of the brains behind what's going on, as an evolutionary development. So humankind is becoming more than what it was, or becoming different than what it was, by no longer being they are still one single human race. They can interbreed, they can understand each other, but they've become very different kinds of humans, adapted to different circumstances, but still carrying on commerce with each other, still carrying out some sort of engagement with each other. And so that's where it's going in the mid part of the story. And then there's some developments later on where there's this realization that as humanity goes further into the cosmos, it needs to take these now not completely isolated, but separated parts of itself and breed them back into each other. And so producing a human being, a human race that would be more hardy and more universe-oriented than the others are, who can be a little short-sighted. So I thought one of the interesting philosophical questions that this raises is a kind of ethical question. Is it good or bad in general to separate out these different aspects of what it means to be human? I mean, we do it already, right? In the way that we specialize in labor, and we have subcultures and things like that. But here we're talking about entire worlds. Is that a good thing for humans as a race, or is it a hyper specialization that in some ways disconnects us from our humanity? And then one of the characters in Soldier Ask Not, the central character, he actually tries to engineer the destruction of the friendlies. He thinks that it would be better to wipe out an entire part of, or an entire aspect of humanity. So I mean, if you think about this, if we put aside Dickson for a minute, and you think about like our own character traits, take acquisitive competitiveness, for example, the sort of thing that lies behind our commercial enterprises and interests. Would it be good for us to bring that part of ourselves out into the open and then get rid of it? What do you think? I mean, psychotherapy in a way, or also virtue ethics and spiritual direction, isn't part of that about like figuring out which parts of ourselves we want to keep and which parts we want to get rid of? So if we could do that with not just us individually, but like the whole human race, what parts would we want? Obviously, we want to keep the Dorsai because we all like warriors, right? And the hard scientists, they're very smart, so let's keep them. But I mean, are there parts of ourselves that we, I think it's kind of an open question. Do we want religious fanaticism, the tendency towards that sort of thing, to be part of our future? Or would it be better if we could actually bring that out of ourselves and then get rid of it?
If you're a religious fanatic, though, you'd probably like to keep it around.
Well, yeah, that's very true. But there's others who want to keep it around, too. The exotics think that it's important to have all these different parts because then when they're bred back in, if you were to so you isolate them out, right? You eliminate some, and then you put it back together, it's not going to be the same whole. It's not going to be as fully developed. I think we would tend to think, it's great, you isolate the stuff out, get rid of the crap, and then bring it back together, and you're going to have an even better human being. The exotics don't see it that way. They think that it's important to have all of the aspects of a human being, or else you're not healthy in some respect. So that's one key theme. Another one that actually I mentioned, we'd come back to this key idea that's there in the encyclopedia, or in the Necromancer one. The beginning of Necromancer, and really most of the story, there's a vast technological apparatus running the world on Earth. You could think of it as an ensemble of logistics and science, technology. It's aided by a vast AI, which is capable of projection, rational decision making, has a lot of forces at its disposal. And the idea is that it's going to benefit humanity, right, by making this is sort of like giving us a post-scarcity economy, right? Mm-hmm. And then the question is, well, what is the what is the status of human beings like? And if we put aside Dickson's depiction of it, and we just imagine a situation like that, like, where we might be heading if things don't go off kilter. Like, let's say global warming doesn't kill us, and maybe the reforestation thing that people are talking about now, maybe that'll fix it, and we find some political solution that gets us away from fossil fuels, and maybe we rework the economic and political system so the AI that's clearly coming at us and robotics and all that winds up benefiting all of us, not just whoever happens to own the tech companies or factories or logistics companies or things like that. Would people really be happy or not? I know I would be happy to not have to scramble for jobs, as sort of a contractor, teaching as an adjunct, having clients and stuff like that. If I knew I had a steady stream that would assure me that like all my needs would be taken care of, so I can eat what I want, I can travel when I want, healthcare is provided. What else would we want to throw in there? Access to if I want a book, I can get it wherever. I'd be pretty happy because I would still continue doing the kinds of things that I do because I'm intrinsically, I intrinsically desire to study philosophy and talk about it, right? But what would most people do? I mean, you'd keep doing what well, I don't know. Would you keep doing exactly what you're doing, or?
I might be a bit choosier.
Yeah.
What I'm doing. Maybe take on fewer projects.
And spend more time on them and go deeper into them. And, yeah.
And
So there's
take more breaks.
And,
more naps, more reading.
More walks. Yeah.
A lot of people do more video games.
Well, so that's what I was thinking. There's the entertainment aspect, right? You can, and the video games are getting, vaster and vaster and more complicated. You can easily lose yourself in a video game for months at a time, I would think, 10 years from now. I mean, I was talking about this with somebody who's around my age, and I was saying, do you remember those crappy Atari systems that we had? And it came with the cartridge that just had the planes and the tanks, and how we could sit there for hours looking at this stupid, crappy video game. And some people would actually get drawn into it and get addicted to it even back then. There were even people who got addicted to Pong, which was awful, And now the video games are so much more well thought out. There's, musicians that are hired just to produce the wonderful scores, and there's they hire storytelling people to figure out narratives and all that, and then 10 years from now it's going to be even better. So maybe that's what happens with a lot of people. They just kind of consume.
Isn't there one theory, Fermi's paradox, the where is everybody question?
Tell me more about that.
It's the question of statistically there should be more advanced civilizations capable of contacting Earth than there are. One theory for where people have gone is that once a civilization hits a certain point of advancement, they turn inward and they spend all their day in virtual reality or in sort of happiness machines, high-end endorphins or their species equivalent, and they just don't think of contacting other planets because they're indulging in pure hedonism and super stimuli.
That one I hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
I think the context in which I've heard of it have usually been joking, where they're maybe aliens, they're out there all over the place, but they see the transmissions that we're sending out, and they're like, we don't want to be associated with these jokers. Maybe that you could imagine all sorts of sort of societal evolutionary paths that would be in effect dead ends, because if you're not reaching out further in two important respects, you're not going to continue to develop. One would be to engage with the physical environment more, and that's challenging enough, right? Mm-hmm. All we have to do is get out of a game world and actually go walk in Lapham Peak Park and see stuff that's way beyond what Minecraft or anything can provide us with, and look at it and just check it out. to know that there's something there. And so if we're talking about like space exploration, I mean, think about the vast possibilities. But more important than that, I think, would be contact with other intelligent life, because it would present such a challenge, right? I mean, we have a hard time even figuring out what the hell we are as human beings and how to engage with each other. Imagine that we meet another species, and they're not just like in Independence Day wanting to take our water and kill all of us or something like that. They actually are interested in who we are and what our background is, and exchanging information and stuff like that. That would be occupying us for generations. So a culture that evolved into just being, as you were saying, hedonistic, wouldn't die as such, but in a way it's sort of moribund. It's a dead end. The way to develop is by doing more and going further, which then could bring you into conflict as well. And that's what part of where I was going with this is, in the first story, human beings, it's not enough for them to be entertained all the time. Some of them, they're cool with that. Some of them are fine with having productive, sort of almost like George Jetson kind of jobs where you push the button, everything's laid out for you, your job is not very challenging, or if it is, the challenges have been built in so they give you some spice. But other people participate in religious cults because that gives them some meaning. There's some sort of transcendent thing. And then others participate in these marching societies where they sort of mindlessly run through the streets just destroying things. And, there's other possibilities too. We could imagine people becoming members of fight clubs, doing things that would somehow stimulate them. And I think that this is a big problem that we're facing now. If we do wind up with a post-scarcity society, do we end up with human beings unable to really productively manage that condition? And would they just be content with a hedonistic lifestyle, like sort of Nietzsche's Last Man, or would they need some excitement and need to break things? So in this, it becomes a moot point because the computer, there's another wrinkle to it as well. The computer realizes that we human beings are irrational, and the best way to deal with that, the whole vast world system, would be to minimize the freedom of human beings, to turn us into as close to like circuits as possible. So there's a bit of the machine running away and becoming the enemy of humanity as well. But it ends up being a moot point because the machine ends up getting supplanted by the main character and some of the other people involved, and that's when they start doing the fanning out across the world or the universe. Which in a way, it's sort of like, or it's not that different from, say, Dune, where you've got the thinking machines and then the reaction against them, and you've got humanity in all these different places. Although Dune, there's tens of thousands of years of back history before that. Humans have been out in the stars for as long as anyone can remember, whereas this is, it's fairly recent. But this opposition to being reduced to cogs in the machine is kind of an interesting philosophical point, I think. Well, do you have any thoughts about that, or any further thoughts?
I think you covered it, yeah.
Okay. Another thing that comes up in this is, we talk about the great man theory of history sometimes, and it could be great women too, or great whatever. And I think a lot of narratives work that way, especially when there is something. I'm reminded of the Foundation, right? So Asimov has Harry Seldon. He's got this. What was the name of the discipline that they used? Psychohistory.
Something like that, I think.
Yeah, and it was predictive. It would be this new discipline that would be able to take human beings as aggregates and predict how economic trends would go and where conflicts would arise. And it's so predictive that you could even like create a vast plan. Well, the exotics developed something like that. They call it ontogenetics, and it's very similar to. I think it's psychohistory. It's very similar to that. You can predict in general how things are going to go, but there's some individuals, this is where the difference is. There's some individuals who are less passive nodes within the whole network and more active, and they can't be predicted as well. And they tend to be associated with these different splinter cultures. So, for example, the newsman in Soldier Ask Not, he is one of those characters, and so are the Dorsai characters as well, and the exotics just kind of hang around these people and try to push them the right way so that they're still part of the plan, but they realize that they can't fully determine them, and so it's kind of an interesting idea about human agency, and the implication of it would be that most people, maybe even all of their life, or at least part of their life, are not really free. They're not really making important decisions between different options. They're going to follow along a course. Only the people who really affect human history in important ways, unpredictable ways, would be free. I don't know if that's the right way to read this, but it seems like that would be one risk of having a discipline like that. You've got like the vast panorama of human beings all interacting with each other, and then if that's the case, they may as well be computers, right? Or NPCs, right? And then you've got the player characters who are actually doing stuff that changes the script, at least for a while, and some of them are thinking very strategically, and some of them are, you could say, they're contending against each other. So you've got this guy William who wants to take over. He wants to take over the entire human domain. He wants to have all the worlds under him. He is from Keti, and he's like pulling strings here and there. And his opposition is another one of the Grahams, who outmaneuvers him over years and years and years. So, but I don't know. What do you think about that sort of, we could call it the great human view of history?
I think I'd probably lean more towards the Hari Sheldon theory, where it's like either everyone should be predictable or nobody should, but to have the random player characters among the NPCs seems sort of unlikely. Unless they'd be able to find people who are predictably unpredictable.
What would that mean, though? To be they're unpredictable, but only within certain parameters?
Or that you'd be able to figure out that a given number of people will be hard to predict. You'll build in a margin of error in your model.
Okay.
The lunatic fringe, I think it's sometimes called in
the super outliers, right?
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing. It's not really explored in these works as far as I can think of, but any predictive system that's based on, some sort of metrics, right? There's, insofar as it's not the same thing as the universe that you're trying to predict, there's always some things in the universe that tend to go against it, that you didn't account for. And sometimes the difference is, small enough where you're like, it approximates it good enough, right? But then sometimes those approximations, it can get bigger and bigger and bigger, and because you don't know enough about how the universe precisely works, you can't be confident that your margin of error really is your margin of error, right? I remember when I was studying mathematics, and I took a prob and stats class for the first time, and I was fascinated with it. The theory of probability is really quite cool, when you get into it. And there's all this stuff about confidence intervals, and that's where they stopped. And they're like, well, this is how you calculate it. This is what you do to get to this place. And then I was, this is how I could tell I was a philosopher. I was like, well, what underlies that? What gives you enough confidence about the confidence interval that you've got? How do you know that you couldn't be like totally off? And they would just look at me like I was crazy, because they didn't want to entertain that idea. So, Here's another thing that's connected with this great human theory, which I guess, if you're going to write a narrative and you want the characters to be compelling, you probably got to endorse something like that. I mean, to go back to the foundation stuff, right? Is there any character in there where you're like, man, I really love that character, other than like maybe the mule, who is a standout, Or are the characters basically just there for a couple chapters to drive the plot?
Maybe, but that's more, I think, a writing approach than a philosophical one. Because lots of people write without doing the great man of history and still write compelling characters just by taking an interest in the person you're writing about. It might be rarer in science fiction, though, especially if you're doing stuff on a
where it's a galactic or
scale.
yeah. So not in the very first stuff, but later on as humanity's starting to like ideally come back together, there's this character of the responsible man, which is the phrase that they use, or Dickson uses for it. And the responsible man is going to bring together these three aspects or disciplines from the Dorsai. So you got the military, courage, and then the exotics, philosophy, but then the third one is the friendlies, the faith or fanaticism part, and somehow they integrate these, and the idea is that this person is the one who like can decide for humanity where they ought to go, because they've fully integrated these, and you wonder, well, why not also like the hard sciences, Or I don't know, maybe the farmers should have something to say about it, or the work ethic.
Yeah, or the commerce, economics.
Yeah, but it's those three that Dickson keeps going back to over and over again: courage, wisdom, and faith. And I have to admit, I don't fully understand why those three. I understand why the characters say that those three are particularly important. I don't understand why the other stuff should be left out, why those three should be most directive. And I guess I'm enough of a Platonist where I don't have a problem with the exotics, the philosophy part, or the Dorsai part, but why do you need religious fanaticism, or at least the danger of religious fanaticism, to bring these together? I have to admit, I don't fully get that.
Yeah, I feel like fanaticism and courage would overlap quite a bit anyway.
Well, that's an interesting point. So they kind of do, right? I mean, there's a kind of courage that comes with it, but like Aristotle talks about this, the person who doesn't feel fear when they ought to feel fear, they're not really brave, right? They're something else. They could be like insensible to dangers, and there's a, for Aristotle too, there's a certain, it's almost like there's a certain failure of humanity in being that brave. Whereas the courageous person, they're where they ought to be. They're fully realizing human nature. For Dickson, somehow the friendlies, there's excesses. There's ones who are fanatics in the sense that they will throw themselves into battle. There's also some who are fanatics in the sense that they will, they don't care about other human beings as human beings because they're like, well, they're not part of our religion, they're not chosen, screw them, let's kill the prisoners. I don't know. This is something I still have to think more about myself.
Are there points in the books where a character does something that's like, this was clearly a faith-driven action,
yes,
and it was the correct one?
Yeah. So in Soldier Ask Not, I'm forgetting the name of so there's this guy Tam. He's the main character, and he's a flawed character, unlike the other characters in the books up to that point. He's sort of he winds up at the right place at the end, but his trajectory across the whole thing is that he wants to become part of this news guild because that way he can avoid being under contract to anybody. We should talk about contracts in just a bit. So he'll be free, and he can go anywhere in the universe. And then he's got a sister who at first gets engaged to a guy from the Friendlies, and I'm forgetting his name, but I think it's like Jamathan or something like that. And he tells her that she shouldn't marry him, that she's not going to be happy on the Friendlies, and so she breaks it off. And he goes back and becomes a force commander, which is kind of like a low-level thing. And then she marries a guy from another planet. And that guy gets called up on military duty. And so this guy Tam is going around and covering story after story, rising in the organization. He finds that he's a person who can easily manipulate people. He can tell what most people, except for the sort of almost superhumans who run history. Everybody else, he can sort of figure out what makes them tick and say the right thing to get them to do what he wants, to give the information up and all that. And so he goes out to cover the war that's going on that this guy's been conscripted for, and he pulls him out of the lines and has him be his assistant. He's not able to get him a safe passage from the other side, which is the Friendlies, because the Friendlies are acting as mercenaries on that world and that conflict. And what ends up, long story short, they get captured. The Friendly commander executes all the prisoners, and so Tam now hates the Friendlies. He also gets shot in the knee, and so he screws up his knee and stuff like that. And it screwed up his relationship with his sister. Later on, in another conflict that he's covering, he meets back up with this first fiance, and he has a lot of dialogue with him. And quite a bit of it is, like your religion is bullshit, But this guy is portrayed as being sort of like a genuinely faith-filled person who embodies the better parts of the faith, And he ends up dying. And the reason he ends up dying is essentially to save his troops. They're left behind on this planet. They're not going to be reinforced by the other friendly forces. And he organizes a parley with this Dorsai general, one of the Grahams, and or not general, commander of some sort. And then deliberately, he and his 4 men who come along, they draw their weapons and attack the Dorsai, knowing that the Dorsai's reflexes are going to be so good, he's going to kill all of them. And this action, which violates the mercenaries' code in certain ways, what it does is it ensures that his troops are going to, instead of just being mowed down or something like that, they're going to be allowed to surrender and go back to the Friendlies. And he's portrayed as by Dickson at least, in that as having sort of this confidence that his faith gives him, that allows him to be able to pull something like that off. So that's an example of somebody who's, the good side of that faith. I'd mentioned some contracts. Contracts are the way that individuals and worlds, you could say, relate to each other. And you're under, like if you're a mercenary, right? You have a contract and somebody owns your contract. And in many of the worlds, there's a division between what they call the loose contract worlds, and I forget exactly whether it's tight or another word for it. But the basic idea is on some worlds, like the science worlds and Ketty and the Friendlies, your contract can be bought and sold many times, very easily. It's sort of like there's an open market for it, and the world can tell you to go somewhere. And so think of the contract as a way in which either government or some other entity can order you around and tell you what to do, allegiances. On other worlds like the Dorsai, the Exotics, Freyland, and New Earth contracts are loose, meaning that there's a lot of, it's very difficult to just buy up somebody else's contracts and take them away. There's much more agency on the part of the contractor to get to decide what they want to do. And there's actually a struggle between the worlds about, well, how are contracts going to be interpreted? And they come to some compromises about that in one of the books. So if you're like a Dorsai, you're from a world that allows you a lot of latitude about who you will contract with. Once you've contracted, you're stuck, right? So if your employer contracts with you for this military campaign and you decide you don't like that military campaign, well, you're stuck. You can't get out of it that way. You have to fulfill what your contract requires, but they can't just sell your contract to somebody else, which is what they can do for the Friendlies. So the people who are the Friendlies, they're really, the world can sell their contracts to whoever they want. It can be bought and sold many times. You can find yourself going all over the little human part of the cosmos without much agency of your own. But you wouldn't really care because you think the church has got things right, so you're not gonna worry about it too much. So that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about social relations, I suppose.
Does Dickson explain how that system evolved?
In part, there's a lot of sort of typical sci-fi hand waving, right? Where he's not going to go into. If he did go into great detail about it, it probably would be kind of dry, I imagine, right? I think that's a good question. Where did he get this idea of contract from?
It kind of reminds me of an indentured servitude.
For the Friendlies, it's definitely like that. I mentioned too, it's a way in which worlds are related to each other. So the Friendlies' main export is human cannon fodder. And those humans are being, and they're all males too. Their contracts are being sold to fight in conflicts, because in each world there's usually some people in conflict with each other. Their contracts are being sold, and then the money is going to the world. It's not going to the family or the person or something like that. The world is using that to then buy products from other worlds. The ones that have loose contracts, it's you're not an indentured servant. You are somebody who has decided to sign up with this or that, and so there's more human dignity, you could say. The miners on Kobe, their contracts at one point really suck, and then there's a revolt, and then they're better. So the conditions of contracts can be quite different, and you could find yourself like if you're a Dorsai, you could be on any one of these worlds as part of a guard or a military command, and your military command might be commanding local troops, or supplementing the local troops. If you're a friendly, they all go more or less together. They don't usually have Dorsai in charge of them, so yeah. I mean, these are all like fundamentally different ways of life. Another theme I wanted to talk about was the inescapability of politics. Each of these worlds has to be economically connected with the other worlds, because none of them are totally self-sufficient. I mean, some of them could be like, the farming world could be self-sufficient in terms of farming, but they need other stuff from other people. And there's probably something to not just an economic thing, but if you think about humanity going out into the void and having colonies in different places, it would be really traumatic, I think, for a world to be entirely cut off from the rest of the human cosmos. You wouldn't want to be totally on your own, even if you really like the sort of character type that you represent. I think even the scientists wouldn't want to totally be cut off from the other ways of living, right? So politics becomes, you notice there is no like political world, right? Politics is something that, and this goes all the way back to like Plato and Aristotle and thinkers like that. Politics is something that kind of spans all of the different human activities and enterprises. And I think you can say it happens on like three main levels in the stories. You've got politics on the worlds, so you've got factions that form and fight each other. That's why they hire the Dorsai or hire the friendlies. There's deliberations about what contracts are going to be like, or where the priorities ought to go. So there's politics in that sense. And you could call that local politics in the sense that it's local to a world. And then you have politics between the worlds, and the worlds will have rivalries with each other, or fight with each other. They're associated eventually into these two sort of leagues, where you've got the tight contracts and then the loose contracts lined up with each other. But then I think there's also a higher level of politics involved that the people on the other two levels typically lose sight of. And you could call that the politics of humanity in general. And so some of the characters, like the William guy who wants to rule all 14 worlds, he's carrying out things at that level. Right? He's not just thinking in terms of making Keti, his world, the most important place. He's not even really that concerned about Keti, except as a stepping stone to controlling everybody. And so that's one possibility for politics, right? And you could also you could come up with all sorts of justifications for that too, like, hey, it's better to have one person in charge because then everybody's on the same plan and we're not having all these inefficiencies. It's easy to come up with rationalizations for that, I think, right? Mm-hmm. But then there's also these characters that are also doing politics on this grand scale as well, like the Grahams, those characters in the stories who are all Dorsai and are trying to, at first like make Dorsai free, and then eventually, make all of humanity free. And then there's other characters too as the story goes on, who are not Dorsai, but they're from, say, Old Earth. This whole development of the encyclopedia, which is such a vast project that when it's completed, it actually has to be put into orbit because it can't exist on Earth as such. And all of that, I think you could say, is like, where is the race going, and how should things be handled? All of that is a matter of this grand politics. And I guess, one of the themes of the stories is the interpenetration of these different levels. It's not like you can have grand politics that doesn't have to take place through the lower level of politics. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking that I don't see any references in any of the things that I've read by Dickson or about Dickson that talk about Hegel. But I think what he's doing is, in some respects, very Hegelian. In a couple ways. One is the whole notion of an encyclopedia of human knowledge to begin with. Now, it would be much vaster than Hegel's, encyclopedia logic, right? But the idea behind an encyclopedia is that you assemble all of the information, and then somebody who's smart enough can actually make use of that and figure out what ought to be done. An encyclopedia is not just a reference tool. It's not just a putting things into boxes for the sake of doing that. It's something that's supposed to allow us to have a sort of panoramic view and then come to conclusions about where we ought to go, practical conclusions, not just theoretical conclusions. I think that's pretty Hegelian. Hegel also thought that ideas really only become what they are. It's kind of interesting. He's an idealist, right? But he contrasts himself against other idealists who don't grasp that ideas have to become real in order to truly be ideas. Things that are not just material but spiritual can motivate us, but they have to take shape. And when they take shape, they always turn out different than we thought. And that's where the dialectic comes in. The dialectic is in part, it's not this, thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing that people portray it as. Rather, it's you have something and it manifests itself. It appears, as Hegel says, and in doing so, it takes on determinacy. And in doing so, it shows itself as being at odds with where it came from. This could be like, people abandoning their ideals seemingly in order to realize their ideals. But it has to become determinate. It has to become determinate down to the level of connecting up with individual human beings and their desires. And at the same time, there's larger, like social dynamics at play. And that's what gets you to a certain point. Now you can reevaluate. You can say, well, did this work or not? And sometimes in the Hegelian dialectic, you actually have to go back because it turns out, well, this actually didn't work out. And I think that's part of what's going on in Dickson's novels, this continual play of... The other thing is, too, at each phase, you can't predict what's coming like a couple phases down the line. As you could if everything was one complete system that was all derived from axioms, and then we just played it out, right?
Yeah.
Because human beings, as agents who reflect on themselves and the meaning of their lives and where they're involved in history and what the conflicts are and what matters, because they make decisions and communicate with each other, history is rich. And it's not without meaning, but it's not something where it's got a linear meaning where we can neatly look at it and predict where we're going. So we think about some of the questions that we're concerned with about our own, coming history, about what AI is going to mean for us, right? We can extrapolate this far, but then we're not able to go much further than that. We need to get to this point so we can actually think through what's going on there, and then we can start thinking more about that. And that's what the characters do in this book. They're he doesn't start out revealing the grand plan in the first book and then just have it play itself out. where humanity's evolution is going is gradually revealed. And I guess it makes sense because, you think about he's writing these stories over the course of, 59. He's still working on this stuff when he dies in 2001.
It's 40
Yeah.
years of...
Yeah, seeing where the story is going, and this is supposed to be part of a larger story, actually. Well, should we call it a story? In some respects, the word
saga.
Yeah, story is too small in a way for that. So, here's a few things that either Dickson said or were said about him. He said. That the Childe Cycle said, in order to make this type of story work effectively, I developed by the late 1950s a new fictional pattern that I've called the consciously thematic story. This was specifically designed to create an unconscious involvement of the reader with the philosophic thematic argument that the story action renders and demonstrates. Because this new type of story has represented a pattern hitherto unknown to readers and writers, my work has historically been criticized in terms that do not apply to it, primarily as if it was drama alone. So people would say, there's too much talky talk, about the grand scheme or stuff like that. Especially people said that about the final encyclopedia story. That was a common complaint. But so his idea is that I'm narrating this vast developmental thing that has to do with where human beings are going as a race, and that's what's really driving the whole thing. So he's making an argument, and the, if you think about it, making an argument means that he's putting this forth as one possibility for us and saying, this is how we should conceive of things, or this is where we ought to go, which implies that there's many other possibilities for where we could go, right? But the larger cycle was supposed to include some non-science fiction books. So he wanted to include some that would be taking place in the 1300s. And then there was supposed to be another novel that was going to deal with John Milton as a faith holder and fanatic. And then the third one was supposed to be Robert Browning. And then there were going to be 3 20th century novels as well that, interestingly enough, were going to focus on the life and character of George Santayana. In order to showcase a philosopher. And then there was going to be a World War II warrior and a female faith holder in the 1980s. That never really came to pass. And even the final book, Antagonist, had to be sort of co-written and then published out of notes with David Dickson later on in 2007. So the Childe Cycle's, incomplete, but, in a way, if you think about what he's doing as philosophy through novels, what that would imply then is that we should look at this as sort of like, who are some other philosophers whose grand projects, they're incomplete, but there's enough of it where we're like, yeah, I kind of get where this is going. Hegel is one of them. I don't know that Heidegger really had that much more to say after all the stuff that he already did say. Maybe Nietzsche, if he'd lived. Or if we possessed the stuff that we've lost from Aristotle, Somebody else who comes to mind too is Boethius. Not so much because of his own writing, but because of the project that he had, which is a civilization preserving project. So Boethius managed to translate Plato's Timaeus and Aristotle's Categories and sophistic refutations from Greek into Latin. his goal was to translate everything Plato wrote that he had access to and everything that Aristotle wrote that he had access to. Had he lived, much longer than he did, because he was executed as a pretty young guy, he probably would have done that. And then the intellectual history of the West would probably be quite different, wouldn't it? But he wasn't able to do it. Instead, the fragment of his project did influence things quite a bit. Because if you've got the Timaeus, and you've got what Cicero and Seneca and a few other sources, like Augustine, are saying about Plato, you've actually got quite a bit of Plato to work with. But it's a Plato that has a particular bent, right? And if you've got Aristotle's categories and sophistical refutations, and then again, what's available in Cicero and a few other authors, you've got enough to do some logic, right? Even before they recover the Aristotelian text from the Arabs. So, it's... I'm not saying that that's close to what Dickson is doing. I think Dickson's project is more broad off than Boethius's project, but it's kind of similar to that. I mean, if you think about other philosopher novelists, they don't actually have that sort of overarching scope in a lot of cases. Think about Dostoevsky. Is there any internal coherence between the different big books, Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, The Possessed, Crime and Punishment? I mean, there's themes, but there's no like grand sweep of this is where we're going as human beings.
Yeah, I'm thinking sometimes you get filmmakers who have movies that are sort of spiritually related to each other. Direct sequels, and be
that's a good point.
A horror movie just came out, Midsummer, by Ari Aster, and people are interpreting it as like the daylight aspect of his vision of horror, while his previous film, Hereditary, is like the nighttime aspect.
Okay.
So by doing multiple films, he's able to do more all-encompassing view of the themes he's working on.
Yeah.
There are a couple of other filmmakers who people have made that interpretation of, but I can't remember.
Where there's some sort of
like
grand overarching project that's unfolding. And the other thing is too, I imagine that when you're doing that sort of thing, it's not like you have everything worked out at the start, all of your ideas, and then you're like, okay, now how can I move these pawns around to fit them all in here, right? The process of writing itself has to produce, or the process of filmmaking or whatever has to not just unfold, but also change what you're thinking of in the process. So maybe Nietzsche actually is a better example of somebody who's closer. The only other theme that I thought was particularly apt to bring up is it has to do with history, and in the middle books and then in the later books, there's this final encyclopedia, and it's taking place on Earth. And the idea, like I mentioned, is you put together all the information on human history, and you'll be able to figure out what's going on. And it's clear that we're not, doomed simply to repeat history like Santayana said, because there's the flip side of that. Those who do remember history, maybe they're not just doomed to repeat it over and over again. But how do we learn from history? Sometimes it's like, well, we shouldn't follow, don't fight a two-front war, or don't invade Russia, right? Those are the kind of things that people draw as corollaries. Or, when we worry about fascism rising here in the United States, we say, putting these camps are really a bad idea because, look at where that goes later on. But I think that that's all sort of like, it's not big picture history in a sense. It's not like, where is the human race going? So if we think about Hegel or we think about Nietzsche, there are these deep reflections on what is the human race or the human being, writ large becoming, and a lot of that has to do with what we make of our own past and our analysis of the present and our ideas about the possibilities for where we can go, and having some sort of discourse with others, not just like deciding in my own head, like some grand ruler where everything should go, but figuring out with other human beings where it should go. So perhaps it's impossible to avoid politics. Maybe if we are going to learn something from history in that way, it has to be something that we do collaboratively, rather than as like the encyclopedist who knows it all, right? And then decides for all humanity. But this notion of having a final encyclopedia, it's kind of an interesting idea. How would it ever be final? Could we successfully get all the stuff together, and then once you've done that, well, who the hell's going to actually work through all of this stuff in a lifetime and make sense of it? Is it just like a plot device, you think, to drive the story forward in that case, or is he really onto something?
I think it is tempting to visualize bringing all that information together, but yeah, in practical terms, it would have to be very selectively edited just for someone to have time to process that much information.
Yeah, that's a factor. And then a human being will forget a lot too. Mm-hmm. So like I haven't. There are some authors where I've read pretty much all that they've written. But I've forgotten most of what I've read. And that's just an author. That's not like, humankind altogether. So, yeah. So maybe it is just a plot device. Or maybe it would require something like going back and having some vast computer system that would analyze it. But then you'd be in the problematic of the computer that decides get rid of human beings. They're actually just they're jamming up the gears, so to speak. The problem with a computer system, as he articulates it in Necromancer, is that it doesn't have that reflexivity capacity. It can't actually tell when its own thinking is off base or drawing on the wrong principles. And it can't really understand what human beings are like. Only human beings can understand what human beings are like. So I think that's probably a good place to end. We've rambled over quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Anything you want to say to bring it to a close, or?
Just sort of the observation of The Dragon and the George, his other series that we is a time, it's sort of time travel, and also has some really intense historical research. So when Dickson mentions that he was going to do historical novels as part of the Childe Cycle,
do you think maybe he did he got distracted and?
Or I'm wondering if he drew on some of the same research, because he was going to write a medieval book for the historicals, right?
Yeah.
So
1300s, yeah.
Yeah, and that's about the period when the Dragon and the George takes place, if I'm right. So he might have drawn on the same resources. He might have found that time period so interesting that he decided, I need to write a book about it for this series too.
Yeah, and if he hadn't written those,
he did spend a lot of time on them. And they're a bit less philosophical than the Dorsai novels. Like, the characters are still intelligent, and there's some interesting, thought-provoking bits.
Yeah.
But it's not the whole history of humanity.
I remember there being some humor in there too, right?
Oh yeah. Even the title, The Dragon and the George, is kind of a joke.
Yeah.
Because it's a pun or a play on St. George and the Dragon.
Yeah, it's been such a long time since I read any of them.
They were fun.
How long ago did you read them?
Oh gosh, I was a young teenager, I think. So.
Okay.
Oh gosh, it's like over 15 years ago now.
Yeah, I'll say this then, sort of to conclude. Sometimes when we go back to these series, like I read some of these Dorsai things when I was a teenager. And I liked them. I definitely didn't get what the hell was going on in the books. And I'm always worried when we go back to these that I'm going to be disappointed. Like, the Piers Anthony, it's okay. Michael Moorcock, this is actually, I'm looking forward to, doing more with Dickson when I have the time, because of this sort of vast historical sweep that he's got in there, and the introduction of philosophy, without going into like bringing in a lot of philosophers. It's quite interesting stuff. So I was really pleased reading this to find something that I could sink my teeth into like that. So, well, thanks for another good conversation.